go ahead and start. I think I have successfully funneled everyone who's tried to go into teams. At this point in time, I'm going to keep it open, and I may need to just sort of direct some traffic while you present, but that's okay. So I'll kick it off because I think you said Justin's at the Flyway Council meeting. So welcome everyone. And so sorry about the little bit of snafu with the links, but I think we've all migrated over here pretty efficiently. Want to introduce Paul Schmidt as our guest speaker today. He's going to be talking a little bit about the Road to Recovery, which I know many of you are familiar with, some of you maybe less so. Many of you probably wondering how that intersects with the larger 3 billion birds effort and the other efforts afoot across the country. And so Paul is going to help answer all things Road to Recovery related, and then some, and talk about the relationship with the joint ventures. So Paul, do you have a presentation that you're going to share your screen? Okay, perfect.
Yes. Yeah, I will share that after just a couple of introductory remarks, Amy. Thank you so much, Amy, for your work in setting this up. And Todd Fear, a big thank you to you for conspiring to bring these two groups together, conspiring in a positive way. And thanks everybody for joining. I just look at this as an opportunity to bring two really important efforts and groups together and ideas together and have a discussion. While I will have a bit of a presentation at the beginning, just so we all have a sense for what we're talking about. You know, Todd Fear he's been on our leadership, first our organizing committee for Road to Recovery, and then that transition to a leadership team. And he's been along that road with us from the start. So thanks to Todd. But we're gearing this presentation to folks who know a little bit about the Road to Recovery within the joint venture community, but don't know, might need a little refresher or might just want to hear a little bit about it before we kick into a good discussion. And that's where we're going to hopefully make great progress together, is in that discussion and dialogue. So we have some ideas on some questions that might prompt this discussion after the presentation, but we first and foremost want to be able to respond collectively to any questions that folks from Road to Recovery have about joint ventures, or the joint venture folks have about what Road to Recovery is about. So again, welcome everybody to this dialogue or engagement session, as we've been calling these efforts. And Todd and I, once the presentations are sort of through, we'll try to facilitate the discussion through hand raising, etc. One thing to note from the outset is that I would like to record this, so I've recorded it, and probably you've gotten a message as you've come on to agree to that. But just so you know, it is going to be recorded because we like to keep a record of some of our work together. So with that, unless there are any questions, I'm going to just kick right into the maybe 10, 15 minutes worth of a presentation, basics of Road to Recovery, what we're about and what we've been doing and what we intend to do over the coming few months at least. So with that, let's see if I can figure this sharing the screen. Hopefully you all can see that. Todd, will you nod if you can see that? Terrific. So again, thanks for joining this. And Road to Recovery, as most of you know, is an outgrowth and a response, if you will, from the 3 billion bird report or publication in 2019. And there has been a good response to that publication and the kind of sobering information and data that came forward. In the case of Road to Recovery, we've been operating with a core staff and a leadership team for more than a year now. In fact, probably a year and a half or two, in one way, shape, or form, and have been making, we think, important strides in developing a new paradigm for bird conservation that's intended to integrate a number of key disciplines in developing science to strategically address actions to recover species. And recover is an important word for us. Let's see if I can advance a slide here, Paul. Okay, so in terms of our staff and leadership team, give you a perspective on that. I'm a part-time director. Some of you have known me from my previous lives, and I've seen the names and faces of many familiar people on this Zoom meeting. And I say hello to each and every one of you who I've worked with in the past, either in my role in the Fish and Wildlife Service or in my second short career with Ducks Unlimited. But in retirement or semi-retirement, this notion of 3 billion birds attracted my attention. And I think this is a worthy effort for me to spend some time on. We are very fortunate to have a social scientist, Dr. Kathleen Holland. We call her Katie. She's on this call, and she also works for the NABC. And so you'll see some integrations here in the staff. We have a graduate fellow that we have now had, I think, 3 or maybe even 4, 3 graduate fellows that have been helping us and hopefully providing them a kickstart to their careers. And we currently have Quinn Carvey, who is on the call, I'm sure, and she's been with us now a couple of months. And an international fellow is an addition we added in the spring. Esmeralda Bravo is on the call as well, and she hails from Mexico, and we're taking advantage of her skills and to kind of build an international network around this effort. And we contracted 2 familiar names, Ken Rosenberg and Tom Will, to help us on the biological side as well. Our leadership team is listed there, and you'll know many of those folks, and they come from a variety of organizations and even countries. So we are really blessed to have a very diverse group of people who help us work within the larger bird conservation community. So fortunately, there have been many advances in ornithology, especially technological advances in the last few years that help us to identify and work in this complicated world, if you will. We think that this work needs to happen on a species by species basis, because even species in the same habitats have different biology and are under different threats throughout their annual life cycle. We think that's an important distinction to some of the other efforts that might have gone on before. But this is to say that note, I'll say it now and I'll probably say it more often. This is intended to complement work like what the joint ventures are doing on a landscape level and other efforts that are out there at different scales and are looking at it in different ways. This is not intended to be, the answer, if you will, but one contributing answer in collaboration with others. Our approach involves deciding what species to focus on, establishing some priorities, targeting research to fill critical knowledge gaps, to determining limiting factors, figuring out how to collect the data and using new research and existing data sources, and then making sure that this information makes it into conservation plans and to managers who will implement actions on the ground. All of those are pretty important to us in terms of making sure that we are recovering species and doing it in a strategic and sustainable fashion. So one of the game changers is this advancement in science itself, especially the technological and methodological advancements that have enabled us to determine the specific causes of declines. That realization led us to develop the R2R process. Some of you knew it maybe originally as a pyramid. We've kind of morphed that a bit over time to look at it a little differently, but the pyramid still works for many of us to think about advancing our knowledge and effectiveness in recovering species along the way. As a reminder, we have three basic or main goals in Road to Recovery. One is develop a process for sustainable species recovery. And we start that with the tipping point species. We want to promote targeted and actionable science that includes both biological and social science. We think that integration is critical to an efficient and effective recovery process. And by doing so, we think that integration increases the efficiency and effectiveness of implementation and eliminates the gap that might happen between science and implementation. So the tipping point species, this was coined last year as we helped in the development of the State of the Birds report. And I see Miyoko too on the phone. She was instrumental in that, in many of the State of the Bird reports. But tipping point species, currently we have identified 104 species that require immediate focused action to pinpoint those causes of decline and develop recovery strategies. Those species will be totally familiar with with you. They show up on many priority lists around the country and across the continent. It's based on the ACAT, the Avian Conservation Assessment Database. All of you are familiar with that, I'm sure. And the criteria basically is looking at their vulnerability to extinction, population trend, and in this case, declines, and evaluating the urgency of our efforts. We've identified those by color coding, red, orange, and yellow, from most urgent to still urgent, but not as urgent, if you will, down the line to yellow. And here's a general look at how that criteria align and how we determine whether it's a red, orange, or yellow tipping point species. I'm not going to go into detail on this. This is listed in on our website, but you can take a quick glance. It's not something we need to go into great detail. Just understand behind this is hopefully, we believe, a logical way of identifying these tipping point species and the urgency around them. And so I mentioned the evolving process and how we look at it. Originally, we thought of this as a pyramid, working your way up, sort of 7 steps. And as a result of one of our workshops, I'll talk about it in a little bit, we began to think of it in terms of phases. And these are familiar with anybody who has been actively involved in planning and executing conservation plans. But so we're looking at more phases, but I think the key thing we want to instill in this process is the fact that we've got social science coming in at every step along the way, as well as biological science. I expect that, by the way, that phasing or that diagram will change over time as our thinking changes. So it's not intended to be the end all. And we want to think about it as we go forward. I like to think of what Road to Recovery does is as a proactive recovery of species by advancing the work of species working groups. There are dozens across the country. Most of them have been organized organically. They just sprung up because of interests of people that are out there who are concerned about a particular species or interested in understanding a particular species. Our information suggests that there's about 40 species working groups that are covering tipping point species. So that means we have 60-some species on that list that are not currently covered by a species working group. So one of those areas that we want to work is to expand the efforts or the reach of species working groups, either adding additional work onto an existing one, or more appropriately, probably beginning a new group on a species that heretofore has not been covered. And beyond the tipping point species, we find that there are dozens as well of other species working groups that are working on species that don't happen to be tipping point. And we hope that what we provide in terms of some sort of process and ideas will be beneficial to both of those groups. It's not strictly limited, of course, to the tipping point species, but that's where our priority lies. And the whole point of this discussion or engagement session today is to try to collaborate with others. And I can't think of a more important group of professionals than those within the joint venture system, and how important it is for this integration between species working groups and joint ventures to occur. And I hope this is just the beginning of a conversation and collaboration with between joint ventures and species working groups. I should stop right here and say that I think Amy sent it out to most all of you, and hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at a spreadsheet that we developed. Actually, graduate fellow Quinn Carvey actually did the final touches on that and recently developed it. And it lists all of the species working groups and people contact information that we're aware of, and tries to align those with the various joint ventures out there. So I hope this is a resource that you'll use going forward to contact people to work on similar issues that you have. So you've probably heard, if you've been aware of the Road to Recovery, you've probably heard of the pilot species. And we have three that one of our important funders, the Knobloch Family Foundation, has invested in. And these are truly pilot species. They aren't necessarily a top of the list of 104, the species that we want to work on first. But it turns out that we selected them because they're where they are in this road to recovery, some very early in terms of understanding limiting factors like the evening grosbeak, and others like the golden wing warbler much further along in that process. And all of this is just intended to be an investment in their work to prove, to sort of do a proof of concept that this idea that we could invest money in the science to advance their recovery is going to work. And so so far, I've been really heartened by the work that all three of these groups have done with the money that the Knobloch Family Foundation has done. And it just proves that we need money, obviously, to do the continued work. And so hopefully with this proof of concept, we might be able to attract additional funds going forward. And some of our history, many of you may have participated in some of the virtual workshops that we have done over the last several years. The first one dealing with the causes of declines. The second, and I think we had 100 plus participants there. The second workshop was in December of 2020, and I think we had over 300 participants in that, and it was sort of developing this process of recovery in North America. And the third workshop in December of 2021 had over 500 participants. So the interest in these workshops has grown over time. We took advantage of the technology to do this virtually during obviously the COVID times. So with this, we have laid a good foundation for what we're talking about, and that is collaborations. And since those formal workshops, we've had a number of engagement sessions with the help of Sarah Kendrick and Edwin Juarez. We have had a great successful engagement session with state agencies. We've had one international session as well, and we hope to have another one later this month. And we're continually collaborating with the likes of NABC. We attended NABC meetings, trilateral, Partners in Flight meetings, AOS, et cetera. So we hope to continue that. Going forward, we have our second hemispheric engagement session set for later this month in a couple of weeks. Esmeralda will be helping to kick that off in partnership with BirdLife International. We have another engagement session that will be open to species working groups and you coming on November 3rd. We're going to bring in some experts around this idea of integration of social science with species recovery. Katie Holland will be critical in implementing that one. And then starting in October, every second Friday of the month, we're going to spotlight the work of species working groups one at a time through a webinar series. So look for announcements and hope you would attend some of those events coming up. And one of the big things we're working towards is our first in-person workshop now that we are, I guess, more or less beyond COVID. We feel safe to get together, and we would encourage participation at this workshop that will be at the National Conservation and Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. The Fish and Wildlife Service is hosting us there. And you will see a more specific and announcement coming out probably later this week, and a registration form if you want to attend that. So one of the other products that we're engaged in, and specifically Ken Rosenberg and Tom Will are working with many folks to develop a species recovery gap analysis. And that might be the next kind of document or phase of our work that will help guide us and be maybe the next generation of the guidance document that is shown here on the left, that if you're interested is on our website as well. So more on that maybe in the discussion phase of this conversation. I thought I would put together a little graphic, or maybe you might call it a formula for success, where we start with species working groups. We think of it as if you add in the biological information around a species, the social science around how human dimensions is impacting that species, maybe some professional economic information, and other kind of professions in a species working group, you might evolve that species working group into an actual, we might call a recovery team, not to be confused with the formality of the Endangered Species Act recovery teams, but we think that word recovery is pretty important because we want to reverse those trends. And if you add that work with landscape level organizations like yourselves, we think there's a chance that proactive recovery will keep these species off of the endangered species list in the case of the United States, and benefit species, other species in North America and Canada, Mexico, et cetera. It's just a little formula for thinking about what we're trying to accomplish. Here's our staff, mentioned them before. Katie Holland is our social scientist, Quinn Carvey, working out of the University of New Brunswick, and Esmeralda is there as our international fellow, hopefully developing and linking us throughout the hemisphere. And so feel free to contact any of these folks, as we want to be a resource for not only species working groups, but yourselves as well, if that is appropriate. And our contact information is on our website. So with that, I will close by just saying, I hope that this leads to making having us work together in a successful recovery. We hope that you think it's important what we're doing, and hope you have questions that either Todd, myself, or any of the folks on the phone are able to answer. With that, I close out and give it over to Todd. Let's see if I can stop sharing. That'd be a good thing, right? That's a good thing.
I don't know. People don't really want to look at me, but well, I'm not going to take too much time, but really what I wanted to do was give a little bit of context from the standpoint of our joint venture. I'm the coordinator for the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture, since I know we've got lots of folks on the phone besides just JV folks. And as Paul said, I'm on the Road to Recovery leadership team. And in our case, which might be somewhat unique, but our joint venture has been plugged into several species working groups really since our inception. And most notably, the Golden Wing Warbler Working Group, the Cerulean Warbler Technical Group, and the International Wood Thrush Conservation Alliance. And those three species kind of make up our flagship priority species, our three kind of top priority species for our joint venture. And conveniently, they also, in terms of their breeding habitat needs, represent the full spectrum of age class and structural diversity of Appalachian forests, from young forest to mature forest old growth. So that works out really well for us in terms of translating those species specific needs to a landscape level conservation strategy. But our participation in those species working groups has been really critical, because a lot of even prior to R2R and the process that R2R is trying to advance being developed, a lot of the information that we have used to inform our conservation planning has come out of those species working groups. The forest management guidelines that have been produced by both the Golden-winged Warbler Working Group and the Cerulean Warbler Technical Group have been integral in informing our forest management planning. The full annual cycle and the international connections, the geolocator work that both of those groups have really helped to spearhead in determining where those species are migrating and wintering. All of that has been really critical to how we've approached our conservation efforts for those species. And when R2R got started, at that point in time, the Cerulean Warbler, the Golden-winged Warbler Working Group was still very active. The Cerulean Warbler Technical Group had actually kind of gone dormant for a little while, and that's actually still the case for the Wood Thrush Alliance. But as Road to Recovery got started up, I really recognize the need, especially since our joint venture has the biggest conservation responsibility for ceruleans. We've got about 75% of the cerulean population within our joint venture. There was a real need to get that group restarted and continue to look at that species, and especially in the context of R2R. We've done a lot of work. There's been a lot of research that's gone into ceruleans. The same could be said for golden wings and wood thrush. But in spite of that, we still don't know a lot of the specifics in terms of where are the really big pinch points across that full annual cycle. We're putting lots of capacity and resources into breeding grounds, habitat work. We're putting more and more into wintering grounds, research, trying to figure out exactly where they're going in that migratory pathway. What can we do next as part of that work to identify where are the specific big bottlenecks? Where are they really getting hammered, to help better direct how we spend those resources, apply those resources on the ground? And so when I got the Cerulean Warbler Technical Group restarted about 2 years ago, that was the first big question that we posed to the group. And as a way to try to address that, kind of pulling a page out of what the Golden-winged Warbler Working Group has done and is still working on, is a combination of doing a gap analysis, of taking a look at all the research that's been done up to this point. Where do we still have the biggest gaps and unknowns in terms of Cerulean Warbler full annual cycle conservation? And then also starting the beginning steps of creating an integrated population model that models that full annual cycle and helps to quantify where along that full annual cycle those big pinch points are occurring. And that project has just gotten underway. We got funding through Fish and Wildlife Service Science Support Program to kick that off. We just finished our first field season with that. But that I wanted to give that as a both example and perspective from both the joint venture side and the species working group side, since both me and several of my staff have played active roles in both of those scenarios. Kind of how we have made that integration work within our joint venture, just as a case study, if you will. And again, I recognize we all know from the joint venture world that we all operate differently and whatnot. But to Paul's point, and that diagram that he showed at that last slide, a way that we've taken that species working group information and really applied it to our JV landscape level efforts. And we're hoping to broaden that. The Evening Grosbeak Working Group, David Yaney, who is on this call, brand new species working group. We have some of the wintering populations of evening grosbeaks, so looking at where we can help them out and pull some of that information into our efforts as well. just to give you another example. So that's kind of all I wanted to say. I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion. But Paul, anything else from, I know there's a few of the Cerulina technical group members on here. Anything else that I missed that you want to make sure I highlight?
From my perspective, you did a great job of trying to transition to the joint venture world, and you got one leg in both camps, and it makes a full person. So thank you, Todd. Questions for Todd or me or anyone else, and then we'll specifically about presentation or what we provided, and then we're going to open it up to discussion. We've got some thoughts about how to guide that, but first, if there's anybody who has something to say, just raise your hand. All right. So figuring that you guys would be really quiet with there's 50 or some people on here, we've got questions for you. So I'm going to just list a number of them to start thinking about and talking about. So how do species-based efforts and habitat scale efforts mesh? Okay. How can R2R plug into the joint ventures and vice versa? The challenges that joint ventures are facing that impact tipping point species. How do joint ventures collaborate across the larger geography and develop coordinated recovery plans within and across joint ventures? And how do JVs collaborate with other international partners to take a FAC approach to recovery? And what's the role, if any, of joint ventures in this piece? So, bunch of thought-provoking questions, and I want to hear from you all. Pick one and start talking. There. Okay. Thank you for listing them, Todd. Good job.
Wow, I don't know this as a quiet group. Something's going on.
Yeah, I wonder too, Ken.
Start calling on people.
Can I turn one of those questions back to you?
Depends upon who you is, but sure. But I got
Well,
you. Go ahead. Who's speaking?
Hi,
I don't know.
this is Jenny Duberstein from the Sonoran Joint Venture, and your first question is actually the big question that I have,
Right.
and your thoughts on how your species-based approach meshes with the sort of more landscape scale habitat approach that the joint ventures take.
So I would kick that one actually to Todd. He gave a good example of it, honestly, because I think I don't pretend to know, while I was involved in joint ventures, and honestly, early on, I'm older than most of you think probably. Early on, when joint ventures were established in the 80s, but I've never worked actually on a joint venture other than I'll say the Arctic Goose joint venture, not one that would relate really well to what we're doing right here. So I'm going to kick that to Todd, and then I love the fact that Keith has got his hand up. Go for it, Todd.
Well, and and we've had this discussion in different forms and ways at joint venture coordinators meetings and lots of places. And it is, on one hand, I know that we all approach our conservation planning and conservation implementation differently. And that's a necessity given our differences in landscapes and partners and so on. And so there isn't a magic formula to it. And I'm not saying we have figured that out. But I do know for us, what has worked is, like I said, those three species, golden-winged ceruleans and wood thrush, are our top three flagship species. And it is convenient that from a breeding habitat standpoint, they do represent the range of age class and structural needs across much of the eastern deciduous forests. And so what we've tried to do is take those species specific needs, and especially where they overlap, because there are even some overlaps in them, and translate them, kind of take in some ways disconnect the species and translate those into more forest management guidelines that foresters in particular can take and apply to a given forest stand. And I won't get into the details on what that looks like. Amanda Duran, who I actually think is on this call, she's our Director of Conservation Partnerships, and she's come up with a really, really, I think, good and novel way to do that, to take those species-specific recommendations and translate them into a more holistic suite of forest management guidelines that does just that. It lends themselves into a much more holistic landscape level approach. And that's where I think a lot of us struggle with is making that leap from the species specific to the holistic landscape level. And for us, it was fairly easy. At least I think. It may not be as much so in other circumstances. But I do think there are probably some examples out there. I don't want to put my friend Dave Smith on the spot, but I know, from the sage grouse perspective, they've kind of made that similar jump from sage grouse specific to sage biome, sage system conservation. And so I think maybe one of the better ways to get at that is, this is an ongoing conversation that, we can have as joint ventures in terms of, let's talk about what's worked and what hasn't. So Jenny, I don't know if that helped any or not, but.
And to me, I'll add to what Todd said and just give a specific, that's why we thought the one place to start is at least develop this spreadsheet that puts it in one place where if you haven't, as a joint venture, or if you're, let's put it the other direction, if you're a species working group and you haven't been in touch with the joint venture coordinator or the science coordinator in a joint venture, I think you're missing an opportunity for some important collaboration on the science and recovery of those particular species. So that little bit of a resource of a spreadsheet, I hope, sparks some work together and some ideas that are spawned from that conversation. So with that, Keith has been quite patient with his hand up. It's great to see you, Keith. Haven't seen you in a couple of years.
Good to see you. That 2 points, I guess. The first was a sort of a simple answer to one of your questions, and you really just answered it, Paul, and that is making sure that the joint ventures priority species in that list of tipping point species, that we're as best we can making a connection to R2R efforts, and then vice versa, making sure that those working groups that exist and as they come online, that there's mutual effort to make those connections. The other thing that I was going to say in response to Jenny's question, and Todd answered most of that, actually all of it, and that is, I don't see, there is no conflict or there's not a dichotomy between a concern with species-specific life cycle needs and a joint venture's need to look at the world as a landscape. Because at least for us, I don't know any other way to define a healthy landscape other than to pick a handful of things that I'm interested in. And for us, we're bound to be interested in birds, and then translate those specific needs and synthesize those specific needs into this sort of larger landscape, defining what the landscape needs to look like. So actually, I'm not sure it's healthy to communicate those two things as dichotomous, that one is actually nested within the other. But I actually raised my hand to answer the question that you already did. We need to find the right appropriate ways to connect our joint venture science with the science that is going on and hopefully soon to go on with a lot of these species that don't have a working group, don't have a formal effort right now.
Great. I'm just super, Keith. Thank you for all those points. The fact that anybody considers these competing interests or dichotomous in any way, you know, we want to get away from that. We want there to be integration, and that's really important. So thank you for that. And who knows, when you start collaborating with the other ideas, what can happen as a result of that. I'm pretty positive it's going to be good. Ken Rosenberg.
Yeah, hi, everybody. I was just gonna also jump in to address Jenny's question, because that really is a key question that obviously we're all in discussion, even internally within Road to Recovery. I mean, for a lot of people, it's like, oh my God, and now they're gonna go back to single species conservation. And Keith just did a great explanation of why that is not true. And it's great to see people like Keith, you know, for people who we've all been trying to think of this about this stuff for 30 years, and it's nice to see us converging. The only thing that I'll add to that idea of this being a false dichotomy is this idea of an asymmetry. And that is that, I mean, we all have our priority species lists, and Keith did a great explanation of why there are priority species to help guide the landscape design. But the reason that we have these tipping point species today is because our 30 years of efforts in conservation and addressing a lot of the broader issues are not working necessarily for all these birds, and they're continuing to tank. And in a lot of cases, we don't know exactly why that is. So our emphasis on the species really is to fill in those gaps, to help design the landscape so that these birds are not slipping through those cracks. And if we design the landscape with those most needy species in mind, then we're going to take care of a lot of other species along the way. So that's really the way to look at it. And I actually gave a talk that had the title in there of false dichotomy, but Keith did a great job of explaining that. We really don't want you to think of this as you know, a single species, a species by species conservation process necessarily. And Paul's slide about how that fits in to the landscape is really important.
Thanks, Ken. Todd?
One, I wanted to point out, Amanda posted in the chat a copy of the guidance that I was talking about that she's developed. This particular version is kind of Virginia specific, but the concept is what we're hoping to apply across our joint venture. So just wanted to note that. And then I got a question about, you know, how is Road to Recovery value added? How is that approach value added to our joint venture, and how our joint venture operates and our implementation plan, strategic plan, et cetera. And there are a couple of things that I think are really critical. One is that Road to Recovery, just the emphasis on the bottlenecks, you know, that was one of the very initial things when Ken and Pete and Tom and others were initially describing the Road to Recovery approach to me, is, you know, for ceruleans, for example, we know a lot about the breeding ground habitat. We know generally what we need to, not even generally, we know somewhat specifically what we need to do. We don't know really how much of a difference that is making. And so from our partnership standpoint, and really talking about what's going to be the most efficient use of our resources, especially in our case, I've really pushed our joint venture to do more international work. And you all have heard the JVC folks on the call have heard me on that soapbox for the rest of the JVCs to do more international work for our migratory species. And so this approach really helps us define, or is on the way to helping us define, where are the most efficient and most needed places to put those resources, whether that's research, whether that's management, whether that's developing new partnerships. The other thing that I think is really important, and this speaks a little bit to what Keith was saying also, but also speaks to a conversation we had at our last JV coordinators meeting. It's an ongoing conversation. You know, there's no shortage of work and needs that we need to address on the ground, and joint ventures have a limited amount of capacity to do that. as do, you know, anybody on this call. We've all got our limits in terms of capacity. And I think what road recovery has the potential to do, especially with these tipping point species, is provide a source of capacity to address and identify some of these species specific needs, takes that weight and that need off of us in some ways, but we can be benefactors of that information and take what comes out of the work of these species working groups and road to recovery and plug it into our conservation planning, kind of the way that we've done for ceruleans and golden wings. So those are, you know, in a quick nutshell, those are what I see as some of the specific value added components of road to recovery, at least from our joint ventures perspective.
Thanks, Todd. While we await another hand going up, let me just be so bold as to make a suggestion that the joint ventures can be helpful in identifying and getting startups to new species working groups. We, of course, in the Road to Recovery are really interested in seeing some science around those 60 other species, 64, I guess, by my math, 64 species that do not currently have species working groups. It doesn't mean that there isn't some work being done on a particular species to identify factors, limiting factors, but you know, we think the fact that there might be a team of people who would come together around those ideas in for a species or maybe a suite of species would be outstanding. Our vision is that someday, hopefully not too far away, that these species working groups are actually funded, whether they're funded by a government like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or they're funded through some other funding source, that they get real dollars to have people lead them as their full-time responsibility so that we can actually avoid listings. I'm reflecting on conversation I had the other day with two former directors of the Fish and Wildlife Service, Jamie Clark and Dan Ash, and in particular, Jamie Clark, who now heads up the Defenders of Wildlife, thought this is exactly what is needed in the world so that they don't have defenders, as you well know, has kind of focused a lot on the endangered species side of things. They'd much rather not be doing that, to be honest, and they want them not to be occurring. And this is a proactive recovery process. Okay, enough of me. Connor, I want to hear from you in your field of, looks like sunflowers, maybe. I don't know exactly.
Yeah, fiddleneck, the spring bloom of California this year. Two things. One, like in our implementation plan, we noted a number of potential working groups that we would be interested in helping to coalesce or support the establishment of in BCR 32 related to R2R species. So that definitely tracks. But just thinking more broadly, one I think one important linkage between R2R working groups and joint ventures that I am most interested in is, and Todd, you touched on this a little bit, which is if we can understand some of these limiting factors, some of the challenges that are being faced by a species in need of recovery, and within the scope of our joint venture or joint ventures more broadly, that then we can translate those into community level and sort of regional needs that are not necessarily species specific, but that are relevant to the communities of which we serve. So I'm thinking, and I know, you know, black oyster catchers not on your list, though it's something of a particular concern given the pressures of sea level rise on the West Coast and its, you know, real struggle at maintaining viable populations. That like clear habitat limiting factor has real repercussions on the communities of interest. The farmlands, the coastal communities that also generate and are sort of exposed, are offer opportunities for real funding. And so bringing that clear linkage between a species specific need and the broader sort of impact to well-being among the communities of which we serve feels like a real opportunity. And I know you're mentioning social science. That's something that, you know, maybe we can talk a little bit about what you're really talking about with social science, but there's a real clear linkage there that could happen where these limiting factors could really inform our approach to community development.
Awesome, Connor. Thank you for that input and ideas. I'm gonna put Katie Holland on the spot since her profession was called out there, and add some value to that conversation, Katie.
Yeah, certainly. I find myself in a lot of conversations that end up to some degree talking about landscape scale conservation and species specific conservation. And from a social science perspective, it doesn't much matter really, right? Sometimes when you're defining which social science or human dimensions issues you're going to prioritize or dive into, then it may depend on what you're prioritizing, right? Are you focusing on one species, a limiting factor, and then moving out to what are the human dimensions issues related to that factor? Or, you know, where I find myself very frequently in conversations with the species working groups is that they don't know yet, right? So the information to really pinpoint threats as to what the threat is and where it's most impactful to the species, we don't know. We're working on knowing, but we don't know yet. Then you can think about kind of working backwards as to what are some of the human dimensions issues across the landscape, the communities, Connor, like you mentioned, that are the human communities that are within these geographies that matter very much, that may face a lot of issues of environmental justice, resource access, impacts from climate change, how are those things impacting the people involved? And if we can address the impacts to people, if we can increase and support positive human well-being, then we are positively impacting the environment. And then we hope that as we're learning more information about these specific species needs and reasons for declines, we're already have a step up in addressing some of the human social related issues that may overlap with those biological threats and impacts. That's a lot of the conversations that I'm having. I think, you know, going back to kind of the original or one of the questions of how can R2R engage with JVs and vice versa, I think the human dimensions questions is an easy place to really find that overlap because they impact the species in the JVs, and they also impact the broader goals of the joint ventures. And I know some of the joint ventures have fantastic social science capacity built in or partnerships established that are providing that capacity, and some don't. And so in my role, that's a place where I could be supportive in providing that overlap in connecting JVs with species working groups and finding those linking social issues and social projects and work that we could be doing. That said, the field of social science is huge, and that term encompasses so many different things. And so those conversations would have to be a lot more targeted around specific habitat needs and species needs.
Thank you, Katie. Very good. And while you were talking and while Connor was talking, it occurred to me that one of the real benefits the joint venture, or one of the I'll say the skill sets of a joint venture is you tend to bring partners together, and those partners are oftentimes could be those same people, landowners, et cetera, that might be part of the solutions to problems down the road that are identified. And so the sooner that there's a conversation around that, in a safe environment like a joint venture, it seems that solutions will be more relevant. We're often challenged by questions like, well, how do we know who to work with until we've got, done all the biology to determine the limiting factor? And so you wait till the very end to then engage a particular human sector, if you will. And we're trying to move that understanding and that interaction and that partnership and that collaboration as early as we possibly can, before you have those answers or any finger pointing associated with limiting factors. So anyway, I ramble, and I want to hear from David Yaney, who is a part of one of our pilot species working groups, the Evening Grosbeak. Hey, David.
Hey, Paul. This is a good discussion, and I think I've expressed with you all at R2R several times how much I want JVs to be involved in our group, and you kind of gave a good segue there, actually, to what I was going to say, and related to not knowing who to connect with. Our fledgling Evening Grosbeak group has maybe 65 members on our distribution list, but we'll have maybe 10 that show up to meetings and have been engaged. And we don't really have any involvement from the JVs as yet. And we want to, and for multiple reasons, because you have your own priorities, and we want to see how Evening Grosbeak might fit into that. Also, you may have connections within your region that we don't know about that would benefit what we're trying to do in the working group, which is right now essentially identify what are some of the priority areas for filling in knowledge gaps. We've identified some threats. There's a Canadian management plan that we're looking at. But like Paul said, we don't want to wait until the very end, until the paper's published to just start doing something. We know now that window collisions are probably a problem for Evening Grosbeak. It's a problem for a lot of birds, but we're seeing some data from others that from some of our federal agency partners that are working on analyses that could be an important factor for grosbeaks. We also know that they have a key relationship with spruce budworm, which is an insect, a moth species that can devastate areas of the boreal forest. So there's definitely things we can do now and things that can overlap with other, landscape scale management. So, we are trying as a new group, completely born out of this road to recovery process, to follow it and try to engage with, community level people that may or may not be scientists, to engage with agency staff, to engage at multiple geographic scales. That the grosbeak has a range across the continent in Canada and the US. So it's a large area. And I've got a list of the JVs that we'd like to get in contact with. And I mean, I'd like to hear people's thoughts after I'm done speaking here, but I think I might just drop those JVs into the chat there and my email address and ask you to reach out to me if you're able to provide some input for our group or want to get involved.
That's awesome. That's a great perspective, David. Just a great perspective. And that's what we're trying to inspire or generate, is that kind of work together. Anybody in the Evening Grosbeak, range from a joint venture want to chime in and welcome David to your joint venture meeting?
Well, I will real quick, and I by no means want to hog this conversation at all, but we did. So David, at our technical committee meeting in August, David gave a presentation of what the working group had done up to this point, and a lot of this, it's through R2R and the pilot funding they've received, and it was a really great overview, both of kind of where they are, as he said, as a fledgling species working group, where they're focusing right now, and it really helped us to see where we might be able to plug in. And again, for us, it's on a wintering grounds perspective, which would be a new component for us, but still relates to the forest management that we're looking at doing. But, and I guess this is to kind of broaden this discussion out to both the species working group leads and the joint ventures. If, you know, as you look at the spreadsheet that we shared and you see where there's some overlaps and that there are active species working groups, I think that's one of the best ways to look at what connections might exist and how to best plug in. Like I said, that presentation that David gave was really good. It was really cool to see some of the initial stuff that they're doing. And for us, and especially doing it within the context of our technical committee, you know, gave a really good opportunity to make some of those connections with other partners, just like David was saying. And so that's one of the things that I would definitely like to encourage going forward on both sides, species working group and joint ventures, is seek out those opportunities to make those connections and have those presentations.
Thanks for that, Todd. I appreciate that. And I've noted in the chat, a couple of folks have suggested some additions to the spreadsheet, like adding the science coordinators' contact information. That might be important to connect and to put in there. And then also adding at least one joint venture that we might have missed and called the C3JV. And so we'll amend that or add that information. And we also I want to mention that when we first started thinking about this engagement session, we talked to Todd, and we came upon the decision that we would want to keep this first conversation contained is not the right word, but limited in terms of numbers, because in my mind it could have been a positive if we added all the various species working group coordinators or leads or even all their participants into this conversation. But I agreed with Todd that might get it a little too broad at the beginning or expansive, and that we would start with this kind of more contained conversation. But we need to spread this out to all of those folks, is what I'm saying, is, and maybe it sparks in me a question that I want to have some dialogue around before the end of our time in 20 or so minutes, is thinking about next steps. And I hope that this conversation has at least given you some ideas on what next steps are for you, either from a species working group perspective or a joint ventures perspective, or maybe even from the R2R, because I know we have some leadership team members here who are on the call as well, who might think of next steps that they could do to further this goal of collaboration. So be thinking of the next steps that we would, either you would do, and you don't have to list that out individually, but that we ought to do collectively. And how do we expand this conversation to include, literally dozens or maybe hundreds, I guess, of people who are working in these species working groups, so that they understand that that there are joint ventures out there and that they could be a great resource for the work that they're doing. So I ramble. I haven't seen anybody's hands up, so I'm going to keep talking, and then you'll be really sad about that. I'll pick on some of my favorite people if I don't get hands up, and you know who you are. Tom Will, I've never heard you go an hour with in a conversation in this kind of thing without saying something. What's on your mind? What are you thinking about? I can see the wheels grinding in your head.
I was afraid you were going to do that, Paul. No, I was thinking a little bit about Jenny's comments early on, and one of the things that I always like to hear about is, we can talk about how things can work, but sometimes it's really instructive to identify impediments, pushback, barriers where we're not able to make these key communications and ask ourselves the question, why is that not happening? Or if there is a perceived difference in sort of introducing single species concepts into a landscape plan, exactly where is the pushback and how do people feel that? And the reason for doing that is just so that other folks who've had that same experience can say, yeah, I've done that and here's what we did. So I always like to hear, oh yeah, here's how we solve that one. That is a problem. That is there, but there is a solution. So I'm kind of curious about where those little roadblocks are that people are having issues with when they're trying to implement species specific work on a landscape where they're not quite sure how it fits. And so, so I'm asking the question of the group then, let's talk about that a little bit.
Great. Thanks, Tom. So joint venture coordinators, what are the barriers? Or species working group members, I guess. You said these people weren't shy. What's happening?
I don't know. They're letting me down.
Yeah, I can tell you that you build them up to be pretty, I'd have to control their hands going up. When you got people like Mitch Hartley on here, I don't understand it. Why? What? They must be asleep. I have no idea. Amanda, you have your hand up. I love it.
One of my staff, by the way.
Yeah, I know. It's it coming down. Yeah, she's been well trained, no doubt.
Well, I just wanted to point out one barrier that I always think about when thinking of, single species work is, of course, very important to identify some of those individualized issues. But the challenge is always that it's often the same staff that are participating, the same partners that are participating in each of those groups. So it's sometimes difficult to not, overwhelm for instance, the agency ornithologist from one state that wants to participate and then is participating on a number of different species working groups. So I'm just curious if you all have thought maybe about some resources to help folks that are looking to start these groups, some facilitation assistance, something to make that process easier for those that maybe want to take it on, and ways to engage kind of maybe different people and new people in this work.
That's great, Amanda, to bring that out. I'll take a crack at it because there's sort of a short-term answer and there's my long-term hope. Okay. My short-term answer is, as we put up things on the website, we hope they are some value, connecting people, giving some ideas out there. Our upcoming workshop is going to try to, we're going to spend probably half a day just looking at that question in sense of what a good, strong organization around a species working group entails and how it might function. So looking at some models that might be out there, we hope that all can stimulate ideas and be a resource, a positive resource, if you will. And that's a short term, okay? It's not, that's not a lot. That certainly doesn't write a check, okay? And that's what ultimately we all come down to, is resources and the limitations that we have in that. And so, our goal is to find new money out there around this concept and these ideas, so that we can make a difference in that long run. And that somebody, as I like to say, somebody every day wakes up and their full-time job is to worry about species X, whatever it might be, an evening grosbeak or whatever. They're coming around it, but all those people who are working in those species working groups all have real, full-time jobs doing something else, and not else, but it might be related, but it's not, waking up and worrying about that particular species every day and making plans for what the next piece of information is needed, or what the next group to work with and collaborate with is. So that's our goal is big money for support of species working groups and joint ventures, if you will, to raise all these boats in an effort to build something around a national biodiversity kind of strategy. That's our goal. So I got Catherine, who's been patiently waiting with her hand up. So I'm glad that my embarrassing a couple of people, and Mitch's hand, I love it, because he had, you know, when you mention somebody's name, they got to raise their hand or they really get in trouble. So first you, Catherine, because you volunteered.
All right, well, I just wanted to respond quickly to the barriers question. You know, I work in the Northern Great Plains region, so in the grasslands, we have a suite of these declining grassland birds that are mostly found on private lands. And so one of the challenges that we have is landowner tolerance for yet another crisis, yet another thing that the conservation community is asking them to do. And so we have adopted the philosophy of messaging around the system as opposed to single species, so that we can bring one message to these landowners that might be providing habitat for a suite of some of these declining grassland birds just in their operation. And it doesn't mean we can't do the single species work in the background, but I think we need to be really careful about not turning that into, we need grass height of, you know, this level for this species, because we don't have the landowner tolerance for that. You know, and as you know, many of these birds are little brown birds, are hard to see, they're hard to identify, they're hard to get people excited about. And so anyway, that's just a barrier that we kind of are working through when it comes to the individual species and connecting them to on the ground habitat work.
It's Catherine. Mitch.
Yeah, well, I don't have Paul Schmidt's breadth of experience, but I will say after 20 years, in response to Tom's question, you know, I think what Catherine just said makes a lot of sense. And of course, every place is a little bit different, but on the Atlantic coast where we have a lot of competing priorities and habitats and species, I would say I've never seen us get as much traction with as many partners as when we switched to sort of a single species, or in our case, a 3-species suite of flagship species to focus attention on. And maybe it's because one of those or a couple of those species are just like really plummeting off the cliff. And so, you know, and that's salt marsh sparrow and black rail. And they already had a fair amount of attention from a subset of partners. But in our case, they make excellent ambassadors for habitats. And it's just, I just think in a lot of places, and we're not dealing with private landowners so much. So it's quite different from what Catherine just said. In contrast, we're dealing more with public agencies and partners and NGOs, kind of higher level partners, amalgamations of partners and so on, and professional partners. But at that level, it's really helpful to have a species to point to and say, this species is really falling off the cliff. You need to manage differently. And, you know, there's a lot of nuance there, and we do manage for ecosystem benefits and for fisheries and for broader suites of habitat things besides just one species. But I feel like it's really helpful to have that single species focused, and it's moved our stuff forward tremendously to have that focus. So it may not work everywhere, but it works really well in some fairly broad situations like, you know, the Atlantic coast.
Thanks, Mitch. I knew I could count on you.
So this is Catherine, I'd like to
Yeah,
ask,
Catherine.
yeah, I'd like to ask Mitch a follow-up question on that. You mentioned the species as ambassadors. I'm also wondering if some of that success is because you have such a focus that a lot of your staff time is going into a few species and habitats, and maybe some of your success might, I'm sure the ambassador species is part of it, but how much of that might also be the focus and the success and the having all of you all really pushing in the same direction as staff, and then along with your partners, is that part of it as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I think Amy and others may share a perspective, but I would say it's probably a little bit of both, because for us, the stars kind of aligned. Like we have this great partnership in the Salt Marsh Habitat and Avian Research Program, the SHARP folks, which are academics. But we were, I don't know, in part at least, we were able to get our regional director and a lot of our refuge folks and a lot of our NGO partners focused on this species. And I don't know how much that was luck on our part, how much that was like our staff time and focus, but it's like when everyone starts marching to the beat of that drummer, you know, it's a whole different story. And that's kind of what we found, at least in the Northeast region, you know, with salt marsh sparrow. And yeah, it's a fair question to say, would that have happened if we hadn't really kind of focused on it? And I guess I don't know the answer, Catherine, honestly. And I don't know, maybe Amy has thoughts about that.
Energy, it sounds like really great timing.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, I can chime in on that too. I think it's sort of a combination of us choosing these species, everyone sort of pulling in the same direction and adding a lot of capacity to that, and the value and profile of this habitat rising, especially with the administration, having a friendly administration toward climate change and coastal resiliency, which is on the front lines of climate change. I think that all kind of combined. But even within our flagship focus, I think you can kind of compare the species like the salt marsh sparrow, which has just been like become this huge ambassador, become a species that no one even really knew about or recognized, to like being on the cover of things like the presentation today. Thanks, Paul. But then compare that or contrast that to the black rail, which in the coastal system, you have all those different cars that you can connect to these species. You've got carbon, you've got coastal resiliency and community resiliency, you've got fisheries, and you've got birds and recreation. The black rail is a species that depends on that habitat, but also is going to, in the future, more depend on these private lands with these very specific habitat characteristics. And it's been a lot harder to get interest from people in doing black rail conservation in the non-tidal parts of its range. And so I think that is one of those barriers that we still have to figure out how to move through, is how do you gain the same kind of momentum when you don't have this whole like train full of cars of different values. You've got this one species, it doesn't even really represent a system that a lot of other species of birds depend upon, but it's also lost more than 95% of its population. And I worry about species like that won't get potentially the attention if we can't figure out how to crack that nut, how to divert resources to species like that don't have a lot of other things attached to them.
Thanks, Amy, for adding that. Ken, you had your hand up. You took it down. Are you?
Well, I was just going to come in support of ACJV, but Amy, of course, said most of that. I happened to be briefly on the ACJV management board when a lot of that was happening. And one of the things that I witnessed was the very strong support. I mean, the mandate from the management board on down to focus, to think of those as flagship species. And they're not mentioning what the third one is, which of course is a duck, the black duck, and that helped. So the idea that the three of those combined really are ambassadors for the whole coastal ecosystem. I think, you know, and it was interesting to see that play out, because I think there was skepticism at first, you know, like, why are we going to focus on some sparrow that nobody's ever heard of? But it ended up being this really important ambassador for sea level rise and coastal marsh restoration and all of those things. So, and you know, once people realized that, there was a galvanizing around it. But it came from the management board. I mean, at least a big part of it was the management board supporting the staff to make that happen.
Thank you, Ken. Okay, we have just a few minutes left. I'm going to force you to think about next steps and provide some thoughts back, you know, quickly. But before I do, so be thinking about that. And before I do, I just want to reflect that, you know, when I first started working in this arena, at least the R2R arena, I thought from my old days in the Fish and Wildlife Service that I couldn't imagine a more stronger alliance than could develop as a result of this thought. And that is that within the Fish and Wildlife Service, you could have at least 3 programs actively working together around this notion. And one would, of course, would be the Migratory Bird Program. The other would be the Endangered Species Program, Ecological Services, and science applications. And I thought, what a powerful opportunity this might be to rally around this notion of preventing critical species, things that millions of people care about, and that is birds, in preventing them from moving to the endangered species list or beyond. And I know I'm talking from a U.S. perspective, and it tends to rattle people in Canada, Mexico, but that's my experience, and I think about it in that regard. But enough of that. Just think about, I've just come back to that notion that imagine how joint ventures and migratory bird conservation program and ES and science application could really come up with a huge budget initiative to make a difference. Anyway, I'm done off of that soapbox. Somebody else has to carry that flag, like Mitch. He can take down that. So next steps for this group. Who wants to take a crack at it? Todd, do you want to take a crack at next steps since you got a leg in each camp, or somebody else?
Well, I do think it would be good. I mean, a couple of the things that have come up are, the way that single species work can contribute to the landscape level conservation efforts of the joint venture, and to kind of follow a little bit on David's request, I really think it would be good for the JVs to look through that spreadsheet and look at where there's overlaps with tipping point species, and that tipping point species has a species working group, and then ask yourself, one, are we doing work that might overlap with the need of that tipping point species? And if so, definitely, have you reached out to that species working group to get an understanding of what they're doing? And even if not, if you don't feel like your work is overlapping that species, then maybe it's worth having a conversation of, are there overlaps that have not been identified? But especially to kind of David's point of with some of the species working groups, helping connect them not only to your joint venture proper, but to other partners as well. So that to me seems a good low-hanging fruit that would be worth moving on.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks. I think those are good. I've already suggested we're going to make some changes to the spreadsheet. Quinn will help me do that.
And I think one addition I'll make to that, Paul, specific to the JVs, if there's somebody on your staff that you feel is especially good to have contact information, and it may not be the science coordinator, it may be somebody else, let us know that.
Right. That's a good, that's something for the JVs to tell us. If you'd rather have somebody or either instead of or in addition to what we have there, please give it to us. We would love to spread that word if there's the right person or right position. Other ideas on next steps? Katie, you put something in the chat that's worth bringing out verbally so that everybody can hear it and react to it, please.
Yeah, I have this one and then one more. So I would love to have conversations with individual JVs or groups of you all if you have overlapping needs or interests in the social science realm. I'd love to hear what you're already doing, what's going on, so that I can help to be a bridge to the species working groups about where that work is already happening and exists. And then if I can identify what needs exist, I can focus on how to help add capacity. So I serve as social scientist for Road to Recovery, but also co-chair the NABC Human Dimension Subcommittee, and try to generally make connections, add capacity, build partnerships within that social science realm. So please reach out if interested in having those conversations. And then we had talked about additionally on the R2R end, if there's interest in more focused conversations between individual or a few JVs and the overlapping species working groups, myself and the R2R team are happy to facilitate and coordinate those meetings and conversations. So coordinators can reach out to us if that would take that off of your plate, to have someone can organize and facilitate a brainstorming meeting. We're happy to do that as well.
Great points. Yeah, and we want to be considered a resource for you in the joint ventures as well as the species working group. So please take advantage of that in a positive way. I mean that sincerely. One idea I'll throw out, since I don't see anybody else's hands go up, is for joint ventures to look at that list of tipping point species, the working groups that already exist, okay, and reaching out to them, but also to look at the ones that are not covered, that are on your priority list within your joint venture, and say, hey, I know biologist X or Professor Y or whatever, who might be interested in starting up a species working group and getting going. And maybe you could inspire from the joint venture perspective on that, and let us help you if you identify those. So that would be something to think about going forward. All right. Well, oh, great, Catherine, you're going to get the last word, because I want to be true to the 2:30 drop dead. Justin waved his finger at me. We're only going to be an hour and a half, he said.
Oh, well, I don't, if Justin isn't here, just real quickly, I was thinking, I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but in terms of kind of this communication among JV staff and the species working groups, and forgive me if this has already been said, but I think in our case, Rob put something in the chat about our geography, and we're a little bit capacity limited. We try not to dwell on that too much, but looking at those species groups as ones that might be able to help us with specific questions. I mean, checking in with those species groups to see what they're working on, and then possibly proposing to them questions or things that we might need assistance with. And even if they aren't already addressing those issues or looking into them, possibly those groups seeing if that might be something that would work into their work plan or something like that. That might be something that would be extremely helpful for us.
Super. Thank you, Catherine. Good to see you, by the way. I haven't seen you in a while either.
You too.
Okay, I don't see any other hands up, but so I'm gonna try to wrap it up, and Todd, you can help me, and you can have ultimately the last word. But I just want to thank you on behalf of the R2R staff and the leadership team and the species working group members who are on this call. We appreciate very sincerely, I'm beyond grateful that you opened up your monthly meeting to this discussion. And I hope it's been of some value to you. I know it's been to us in terms of opening up a dialogue that heretofore hadn't been as robust as I think any of us would want it to be. So let's keep the dialogue going, and see what miracles we can work together. That's my closing thoughts, because I think there's a lot of passion around what each and every one of you do, and I feel having worked with many of you, I feel it on a daily basis. You wouldn't have been in this business if you didn't have the passion to make a difference and make a miracle. So let's figure out how to do that together. And with that, thank you, Todd, and I'll let you close her out since you own this screen here.
Boy, I definitely don't own it. No, just I want to thank the JVs who participated. I know obviously we've got conflicts with some meetings and things like that, so we didn't get the full contingent, but I guess for all of you. Any follow-up questions, any thoughts, any comments, anything that you want to ask about R2R, please feel free to reach out to me. Especially with being on the leadership team. We've definitely seen some benefits and anticipate a lot more in being part of the Road to Recovery Initiative and applying it to our work. And so, happy to talk more, happy to answer questions. And then, to that point, I would say within our JV community, let's kind of keep talking about this. There's the Road to Recovery website that's got lots of resources on it too. It's just r2rbirds.org, I think. But let's keep talking about this. I would encourage all of you to be on the lookout for more information about the face-to-face meeting at NCTC that Paul referenced. I'm definitely going to be there, both with my JV hat and my Cerulean Warbler hat. But if there's interest in attending that, I would definitely love to see some more JV folks there. So that's it for me.
All right. Thank you all. Have a great day, rest of your week. We'll see you again sometime.
It's just us.
Yeah, that's it. That's it, man.
Hey, I wanted to say hey to Mitch anyway. I just texted him, and then I thought, oh wait, just us. That's kind of funny.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just texting you. I was like, I'm still texting Jim. Hold on, I can't leave yet. Good job, Paul. That was cool.
Okay, well, it's really good to see you guys. I mean, it really is. Brings back fond and challenging moments in our past. So awesome. I'm gonna close it out. I got another meeting
All right.
to head to. So enjoy
Thanks
it,
for
guys.
hosting.
You bet.
Take
My
care.
pleasure. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.